Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the sensation of cold stone beneath your fingertips, the smell of wood smoke and wet earth filling your nostrils, and the distant sound of church bells echoing across a landscape you've never seen before. Now open them. You're no longer in your comfortable bed with your smartphone on the nightstand. You're lying on a straw mattress in the year 1347, and everything you've ever known has vanished like morning mist. This isn't a dream you can wake up from. This is your new reality. Before we journey deeper into this world that will become your home, I want you to know that you're not alone in this experience. Thousands of people just like you are finding comfort in these stories every night. And if you're enjoying this journey through time, consider subscribing to Dreamless Timelines. We create these historical experiences specifically to help you drift into peaceful sleep while learning something fascinating along the way. But for now, let your mind settle in to the rhythm of this story, and let's discover together what life was truly like in medieval times. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight or even the sound, it's the smell. We're so used to our sanitized, climate-controlled world that we forget what real life smells like. The air here is thick with the scent of animals, unwashed bodies, smoke from countless fires, fermenting grain, and something else you can't quite identify but that makes your nose wrinkle. It's the smell of a world without plumbing, without soap as we know it, without the daily shower you took for granted just yesterday, or what feels like yesterday in your fragmented memory. You're in a small room, barely bigger than a modern walk-in closet. The walls are made of wattle and daub, a mixture of wooden strips woven together and covered with a plaster of mud, straw, and animal dung. The ceiling is low, maybe 6 feet high, with exposed wooden beams blackened by years of smoke. There's a single window, no glass, just a wooden shutter that's currently open, letting in weak morning light that seems somehow different from the light you remember. It's softer, hazier, like looking at the world through an Instagram filter that hasn't been invented yet and won't be for another 700 years. Your clothes feel wrong. You're wearing a rough woolen tunic that scratches against skin that's never known anything rougher than cotton. The fabric is thick, heavy, and it smells of lanolin and smoke. On your feet are leather shoes that are little more than shaped pieces of hide wrapped around your feet and tied with strips of leather. There are no left and right shoes. They're identical, designed to be worn on either foot, and they offer about as much support as wearing cardboard boxes. Your legs are wrapped in woolen hose, basically medieval tights, held up by garters tied just below your knees. There's no elastic. Everything is tied, wrapped, or pinned. You stand up, and the world spins for a moment. Your body feels different, maybe lighter, or perhaps just weaker. The constant low-level muscle tone you maintained from occasionally going to the gym or even just walking to your car has faded. Medieval life has already begun reshaping your body in ways you're only beginning to understand. Your hands, when you look at them, are calloused and dirty in a way that no amount of modern hand sanitizer ever prepared you for. There's dirt under your fingernails that seems to have become a permanent part of your anatomy. Through the open window, you hear the sounds of a medieval village waking up. A rooster crows, but it's not the cheerful cartoon sound you might expect. It's harsh, almost angry, joined by the sounds of other roosters from neighboring properties, each trying to assert dominance over their little kingdoms. You hear the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the oinking of pigs, and underneath it all, the murmur of human voices speaking Middle English, a language that sounds almost, but not quite, like the English you know. It's like listening to someone speak English underwater, or through a heavy accent that makes every third word incomprehensible. You step outside, and the world opens up before you in a way that's both familiar and utterly alien. You're in a village, maybe 200 souls living in small houses clustered around a dirt road that winds through the settlement like a lazy river. The houses are similar to the one you just left, most of them single-story structures with thatched roofs that seem to sag under their own weight. Some of the wealthier houses have 2 stories, a mark of prosperity that's immediately visible to anyone who understands the social codes of this world. The road, and I use that term loosely, is nothing more than packed dirt, rutted from centuries of cartwheels and animal hooves. In the center runs a drainage ditch that serves as the village sewer system. And trust me, you don't want to look too closely at what's flowing through it. The smell is something you're going to have to get used to, a constant reminder that you're living in a world before modern sanitation. People empty chamber pots out their windows in the morning, and while there are social rules about shouting a warning first, those rules aren't always followed. Walking through a medieval village requires constant vigilance and a strong stomach. But here's something that might surprise you. Despite the dirt and the smell and the primitive conditions, there's a certain beauty to this place. The morning light filters through the leaves of ancient oak trees that line the road, trees that were old when your great-great-great-great-grandparents were born. Birds sing in those trees, species you recognize and some you don't, their songs untainted by the sound of traffic or airplanes or the constant white noise of modern civilization. The sky, when you look up, is a blue so deep and clear that it almost hurts. There's no smog, no light pollution, no contrails from jets. The stars at night, you'll discover, are so bright and numerous that they seem fake, like someone scattered diamonds across black velvet. The people you see are already at work, even though the sun has barely cleared the horizon. Medieval life operates on a different schedule than you're used to. People rise with the sun and go to bed shortly after dark, their circadian rhythms in perfect sync with the natural world. There are no alarm clocks, no hitting snooze for just 5 more minutes. When the rooster crows and light begins to creep through the shutters, you get up, because lying in bed is just wasting daylight, and daylight is the most precious resource you have. A woman walks past carrying a wooden bucket, probably heading to the village well. She's young, maybe 20, but her face is weathered in a way that makes her look older. She's missing several teeth, and her hands are rough and red from constant work. She glances at you, nods in greeting, and keeps walking. There's no small talk, no "how are you doing this morning?" People here don't have time for the social niceties you're used to. Life is work, and work is life, and every moment spent talking is a moment not spent doing the 1,000 tasks that need to be done just to survive another day. You realize you're hungry. Not the casual, I could eat hunger you felt when deciding whether to order takeout or go to a restaurant. This is real hunger, the kind that gnaws at your belly and makes you think of nothing else. When was the last time you ate? Your memory is fuzzy, confused, but your body knows it needs food. You head toward what looks like the communal area of the village, hoping to find something, anything, to eat. The village is built around a large open space called the Green, where animals graze during the day and people gather for occasional markets or festivals. At one end stands the church, by far the largest and most impressive building in the village. It's made of stone, real stone, not the mud and wood of the peasant houses. The tower rises maybe 50 feet into the air, topped with a cross that catches the morning sun. This church represents more than just religion. It's the center of village life, the meeting hall, the record keeper, the social center, and yes, the place where people come to pray and seek comfort from a world that offers very little of either. Next to the church is the manor house, home to the local lord who owns all the land you can see and quite a bit more besides. It's a fortified structure, not quite a castle, but more than just a house. with thick stone walls and narrow windows that could be defended if necessary. You won't be going there. The manor house exists in a different social universe than the one you now inhabit. The Lord is as far above you as you once felt above, well, nobody really, because modern society at least pretends that everyone is equal. Here, there's no pretense. There are those who are born to rule and those who are born to serve, and God Himself has ordained this order. Questioning it isn't just socially unacceptable, it's heresy. If you're still following along with this journey, taking comfort in the steady rhythm of this story as you drift toward sleep, do me a small favor when you wake. Hit that like button and leave a comment about which historical period you'd like to visit next. Your engagement helps us create more of these deeply researched historical journeys that help you find peace at the end of a long day. But right now, in this moment, just let your mind wander through this medieval village, feeling the cold morning air, smelling the wood smoke, hearing the distant sounds of life continuing as it has for centuries. You find your way to a small house that somehow feels familiar, like a memory you can't quite grasp. Inside, a woman is working at a stone hearth, stirring a pot that hangs over a small fire. She looks up as you enter, her face showing neither surprise nor particular welcome. She simply nods and gestures to a rough wooden bench near the table. This is your wife, you realize with a start, though you have no memory of meeting her, marrying her, or building a life together. Yet here she is, as real as the floor beneath your feet, and she expects you to play your role in this medieval household just as she plays hers. She ladles something into a wooden bowl and hands it to you. It's pottage, a thick stew that forms the basis of most medieval meals. It's made from whatever is available, barley and oats and peas, maybe a bit of onion if you're lucky, some herbs that grow wild near the village, all boiled together into a thick grayish mush that doesn't look particularly appetizing, but smells better than you'd expect. There's no meat. Meat is for Sundays and feast days if you're lucky. Most days, you eat grain and vegetables, and you're grateful for them.
You eat with a wooden spoon, one of the few utensils in the house. There are no forks. Those won't become common for another few centuries. You have a knife, a simple iron blade that serves a dozen purposes, from eating to cutting wood to defending yourself if necessary. But mostly you eat with your hands and the spoon, wiping your fingers on your tunic because napkins are for rich people. The pottage is bland by modern standards, undersalted because salt is expensive, but it's hot and filling, and your hungry body doesn't care about flavor profiles or culinary sophistication. This is fuel, nothing more, nothing less. After breakfast, if you can call it that, you head out to work, because that's what you do in medieval times. You work. From sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, with Sunday reserved for church and rest, though even Sunday involves some work, because animals need to be fed, and eggs need to be collected, and 100 other small tasks can't be delayed just because it's the Lord's Day. Your work, it turns out, is farming. Not farming as you might imagine it, with tractors and combines and GPS-guided planting systems. This is farming with your hands and simple tools that haven't changed much in 1,000 years. You own a small plot of land, maybe an acre or two, where you grow the crops that will feed your family through the winter. But that's not your main work. Most of your time is spent working the Lord's land, the strips of field that belong to the manor, because that's your obligation as a peasant tied to this land. The medieval farming system is based on something called the open field system. Instead of neat, fenced properties like you're used to, the village's farmland is divided into huge fields, and each field is divided into long strips. You have several strips scattered throughout the fields, never next to each other, so that everyone gets a fair share of good and bad soil. It's inefficient by modern standards, but it's fair in a way that the people here understand. Your strips are mixed in with your neighbor's strips, and everyone can see how hard everyone else is working, which creates a kind of social pressure to pull your weight.
You walk to the fields with a group of other men from the village. They talk and laugh, making jokes you don't quite understand, speaking in their thick dialect that seems to swallow half the words. They accept your presence without question, because you've always been here, always been part of this community, even though you have no memory of any of it. Medieval society doesn't have much room for strangers or newcomers. You're born into a place, and you die in that place. And the idea of moving away or starting over somewhere new is about as realistic as the idea of flying to the moon. The work is backbreaking. You're plowing a field, preparing it for planting, and the plow is a simple wooden affair pulled by an ox that you share with 3 other families. The ox is stubborn and slow, and you have to walk behind it, guiding the plow through earth that's heavy with clay and rocks. Your muscles, unused to this kind of sustained physical labor, scream and protest. Your back aches. Your hands, despite their calluses, blister and bleed. The sun climbs higher, beating down on your head because you don't have a hat, just a cloth wrapped around your head to keep the sweat out of your eyes. There's no water cooler to visit when you get thirsty. You drink from a wooden flask filled with ale, because the water here isn't safe to drink. Medieval people learned long ago that water from the river or even the well could make you sick, though they don't understand why. The ale is weak, maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, just enough to kill the bacteria, but not enough to get you drunk. It tastes sour and flat to your palate, used to the crisp, filtered water that came from your tap. But it quenches your thirst, and that's all that matters. The other men work alongside you, their movements practiced and efficient. They've been doing this their entire lives, just as their fathers did and their fathers before them, stretching back through generations. There's a rhythm to the work, a kind of meditation in the repetition. Push the plow, step forward, guide it around a rock, urge the ox onward, push the plow. Your mind starts to drift, thinking about the life you left behind, the world of smartphones and streaming services and grocery stores where food appeared as if by magic. That world seems like a fantasy now, impossible to reconcile with the reality of mud and sweat and the smell of ox dung. At midday, everyone stops for a break. You sit in the shade of a large oak tree at the edge of the field and eat bread and cheese that your wife packed for you this morning. The bread is dark and heavy, made from rye and barley because wheat is too expensive for peasants. It's coarse and full of grit because the millstones that ground the grain left bits of stone in the flour, and over years of eating this bread, your teeth will wear down to nubs. The cheese is hard and salty, sharp in a way that makes your eyes water, but it's protein and fat, and your body craves both. The men talk during the break, discussing village politics and gossip. Someone's cow broke through a fence and damaged a neighbor's garden. There's going to be a dispute that will need to be settled at the manor court. Someone else's daughter is getting married to a boy from the next village over, a rare event that will require negotiation and probably a small payment to the lord for permission to leave his lands. A traveling merchant came through last week and said there's plague in the cities to the east, people dying by the hundreds, their bodies covered in black boils. Everyone makes the sign of the cross and says a quick prayer, hoping the plague stays far away from this village. But here's what you need to understand, what might be the most important thing about medieval life. These people aren't miserable. They're not sitting around lamenting the lack of indoor plumbing or central heating or Netflix. This is the only life they've ever known, and within the narrow confines of their existence, they find moments of joy and connection. They laugh at crude jokes, they take pride in their work, they love their children with a fierceness that transcends time. They gossip and argue and make up and fall in love and experience heartbreak just like people always have throughout all of human history.
The afternoon stretches on, and you go back to work. Your body has moved past pain into a kind of numbness. Your hands grip the plow handles without conscious thought. Your feet find their rhythm behind the ox. The sun moves across the sky, and you measure time not by clock, but by the position of shadows, by the ache in your belly that signals dinner time is approaching. by the gradual cooling of the air as evening comes on. Finally, as the sun touches the horizon, turning the sky shades of orange and pink that no photograph could ever capture, the workday ends. You and the other men gather up your tools, pat the ox on his broad forehead, and trudge back toward the village. Your body is exhausted in a way you've never experienced in your old life, where the hardest physical labor might have been carrying groceries from the car. This is a bone-deep weariness that comes from 10 hours of manual labor, and yet there's something satisfying about it too. You've accomplished something tangible. You've moved earth and prepared ground for crops that will feed people. It's simple and direct, in a way that your old job, whatever it was, probably wasn't. Back at your house, your wife has prepared the evening meal. It's more pottage, similar to what you had this morning, but with the addition of some cabbage and a small piece of bacon for flavor. You eat together in silence, too tired for conversation, using chunks of bread to sop up the last bits from your wooden bowl. The fire on the hearth provides the only light, casting dancing shadows on the walls. There are no lamps, no candles unless it's a special occasion. Candles are expensive, made from precious beeswax or smelly tallow, and they're not wasted on ordinary evenings. As darkness falls completely, you realize how dark the world can be without electricity. This isn't the kind of darkness you experienced in your old life, where streetlights and house lights and the glow of electronics created a perpetual twilight. This is true darkness, the kind that humanity lived in for thousands of years. It's disorienting at first, almost frightening. You can't see your hand in front of your face. The world beyond the small circle of firelight simply ceases to exist. But your eyes adjust, and you begin to notice things. The fire provides enough light to see the rough shapes of the room. Your wife moves about, cleaning up from dinner, putting things away for the night. Through the open window, you can see stars beginning to appear. More stars than you've ever seen in your life. A river of light flowing across the sky that the ancients called the Milky Way. You understand now why medieval people believed in heaven, why they looked up at that glorious display and thought they were seeing the glory of God. There's no evening entertainment, no television, no books to read even if you could read, which most people can't. Some people might tell stories or sing songs, but tonight everyone is too tired. You and your wife simply sit by the fire for a short while, letting its warmth soak into your aching muscles, and then it's time for bed. There's no brushing your teeth, no shower, no elaborate nighttime routine. You simply climb onto the straw mattress, pull a thin woolen blanket over yourself, and close your eyes. Sleep comes quickly, dreamless and deep. And if you're listening to this story right now in your comfortable bed in the 21st century, I hope sleep is coming for you too, gently and peacefully. If you enjoyed this journey and want to experience more like it, subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more historical stories designed to help you drift off into restful sleep. But for now, let's continue deeper into this medieval world, discovering more of its secrets and surprises. The days blur together in a pattern that becomes familiar. Wake before dawn, eat pottage, work in the fields, eat bread and cheese, work more, come home, eat pottage, sleep. It sounds monotonous, and in some ways it is, but there's also a rhythm to it that's almost peaceful. You don't have to make decisions about what to wear or what to eat or how to spend your time. The structure of medieval life removes all those choices. And while that's limiting, it's freeing in a strange way. Weeks pass and your body adapts. The constant physical labor builds muscles you never knew you had. Your hands become so calloused they're like leather. Your skin darkens from spending every day in the sun. You lose weight, the softness of modern life melting away to reveal a lean, hard body underneath. You're not healthy by modern standards. You're probably malnourished, lacking in vitamins and protein. Your teeth are rotting from the coarse bread. You probably have parasites living in your gut, but you're strong in a way that gym memberships could never make you.
strong from real work that has real consequences. You begin to understand the social structure of the village, the complex web of relationships and obligations that govern every interaction. At the top is the Lord, Sir Geoffrey, whom you've never met and probably never will unless you do something wrong. Below him is the steward, a man named Walter, who manages the manor's lands and collects the rents and labor that erode. Below him are the free peasants, farmers who own their own land and have the right to leave if they choose, though few ever do. And below them are people like you, villains, peasants tied to the land, who owe labor service to the Lord and need his permission for just about everything important.
It's a system that seems impossibly unfair to your modern sensibilities. You're not free. You can't leave the village without permission. You owe several days a week of labor to the Lord's lands. You have to pay fees to use the Lord's mill to grind your grain, his oven to bake your bread, his wine press if you're lucky enough to have grapes. If your daughter wants to get married, you pay a fee. If you die, your family pays a Harriet, usually your best animal, to the Lord. The system is designed to extract as much as possible from people who have very little to begin with. But here's the thing. The system also provides security. The Lord protects you from bandits and raiders. He administers justice, crude as it might be. He provides the mill and the oven and the other infrastructure you need. And most importantly, you have a place in the world. You belong here, to this land, to this village, to this community. In a world without social safety nets, without government assistance, without any kind of institutional support, that sense of belonging is valuable beyond measure. You start to learn the names and stories of the people around you. There's John, the miller, a prosperous man by village standards, who owns a donkey and has glass in one window of his house. He's universally disliked because everyone suspects he steals a portion of the grain he grinds, but everyone needs him, so they swallow their resentment. There's Agnes, the healer, an old woman who knows which plants can cure which ailments, who assists at births and tends the sick. People whisper that she might be a witch, but they still go to her when they're desperate, because the nearest physician is 20 miles away and charges fees that would bankrupt a peasant family. There's Thomas, the blacksmith, whose forge glows like a miniature sun and who can fix just about anything made of metal. He's respected and even a little feared because metalworking seems like magic to people who don't understand it, turning hard, cold ore into useful tools through fire and hammering. There's Father Benedict, the village priest, a younger son of a minor noble family who couldn't inherit his father's lands and chose the church instead. He's learned, able to read and write Latin, and he serves as the village's connection to the wider world of the church, and through the church, to God himself. And there are the everyday people, farmers like yourself, whose names you learn gradually. Hugh and his wife Emma, who have 6 children, though only 3 have survived past age 5. William, who's known for being lazy and always trying to get out of his work obligations. Marjorie, who makes the best cheese in the village and is willing to trade for other goods. Young Richard, barely 14, who's courting Alice from the next farm over with all the awkward intensity of first love. You begin to participate in village life beyond just work. On Sundays, everyone gathers at the church for Mass. The service is in Latin, which you don't understand, and neither does anyone else except Father Benedict. But that doesn't matter. The ritual itself is what's important. The standing and kneeling and crossing yourself, the smell of incense, the droning rhythm of the priest's voice, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself. The church is beautiful in a way that nothing else in the village is, with painted walls showing scenes from the Bible and the lives of saints. These paintings serve as a kind of picture book for people who can't read, teaching them the stories and morals that the church wants them to know. After Mass, there's time for socializing. People linger in the churchyard, catching up on news, conducting bits of business, watching their children play.
The boys play rough games that often end in tears and bruises. The girls play house with dolls made from scraps of cloth and sticks. The adults talk about the weather and the crops, and whether it will be a good harvest this year or a bad one. Everything revolves around the harvest, because the harvest determines whether you eat well next winter or whether you go hungry. Occasionally, there are festivals that break up the monotony of work. May Day, when everyone goes to the woods to gather flowers and celebrate the return of spring, dancing around a maypole with ribbons. Midsummer, when the nights are shortest and bonfires are lit to celebrate the sun at its peak. Harvest Festival, when the last sheaf of grain is brought in and everyone gets drunk on ale and eats more than they should, because winter is coming, and who knows what that will bring. Christmas, the biggest celebration of the year, when the Lord opens his hall to the village and everyone feasts on meat and fresh bread and drinks wine instead of ale. These festivals are important beyond just being breaks from work. They're the times when the community comes together, when social bonds are reinforced, when people remember that they're not just individuals struggling to survive, but part of something larger. The sense of community in a medieval village is stronger than anything you experienced in your old life, where neighbors were often strangers and families lived scattered across different cities or states. Here, everyone knows everyone. You can't escape each other, for better or worse, and that forced intimacy creates bonds that are both comforting and suffocating. But let's talk about something we haven't addressed yet, something that's probably been on your mind if you're a modern person transported into this medieval world. What about healthcare? What happens when you get sick? The answer is grim. Medieval medicine is a bizarre mixture of folk remedies that sometimes work, religious ritual, and treatments based on ancient theories that are completely wrong. The dominant medical theory is based on the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood, and doctors believe illness is caused by an imbalance of these humors. The treatment, therefore, is to restore balance, often through bloodletting or purging or inducing vomiting. These treatments are not only useless, but actively harmful, weakening patients who are already sick.
If you get a minor illness, a cold or a stomach bug, you'll probably recover on your own. Your wife might make you a tea from herbs that Agnes the healer recommended, and you'll lie on your straw mattress and sweat it out. And maybe the herbs help, or maybe they don't, but eventually you get better. But if you get seriously ill, your chances are not good. There are no antibiotics, no antivirals, no understanding of germ theory. A simple infected cut can lead to blood poisoning and death. Pneumonia is often fatal. Tuberculosis, called consumption, slowly eats away at people's lungs over months or years. And then there are the epidemic diseases, the real killers of medieval times. The year is 1347, remember, and while you don't know it yet, something terrible is coming. The plague, the Black Death, is spreading across Asia and Europe, and it will arrive in England soon. When it does, it will kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population. Villages will be abandoned, fields will go unplowed, the social order will be upended in ways that people can't imagine. But for now, in these last months before the plague arrives, life continues in its ancient patterns, and nobody knows that the world is about to change forever. Let me tell you about a typical illness you might experience, something that would be trivial in your old world, but is dangerous here. You step on a rusty nail, a common hazard when walking around the village. The nail goes deep into your foot, and you pull it out, cursing. Your wife washes the wound with water and wraps it in a clean cloth, and you think nothing more of it. But a few days later, your foot starts to throb. The area around the wound becomes red and swollen. You develop a fever. Agnes the healer is called. She looks at your foot, clucks her tongue, and makes a poultice from bread mold and certain herbs. She applies this to the wound and says prayers over you, asking Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims and the sick, to intercede on your behalf. You lie in bed, burning with fever,
while your wife sits beside you and holds your hand, her face tight with worry because she's seen infections like this before, and she knows they often end badly. For 3 days, you hover between life and death. Your fever spikes so high you're delirious, seeing visions of angels and demons battling over your soul. The infection in your foot spreads, red streaks running up your leg. If you were in your old world, they'd put you on intravenous antibiotics and you'd be fine in a week. Here, all anyone can do is pray and hope and apply poultices that may or may not do any good. And then, miraculously, the fever breaks. The infection stops spreading. Your body's immune system, strengthened by a lifetime of exposure to dirt and germs, fights off the infection without any help from modern medicine. Agnes takes credit, saying her poultice and prayers saved you. Your wife cries with relief and promises to donate a candle to the church as thanks for your recovery. And you lie there, weak and exhausted, grateful to be alive, and newly aware of how precarious life is in this world. As you're recovering, spending a few days resting before you're strong enough to work again, you have time to observe the domestic side of medieval life, the work that your wife does every day that you've barely noticed until now. Her work is just as demanding as yours, maybe more so because it never really stops. She's up before you every morning, rekindling the fire from coals that she carefully banked the night before. Making fire from scratch is difficult and time-consuming, so the hearth fire is never allowed to go out completely. She tends it constantly, adding wood, adjusting the logs, making sure it's hot enough to cook on, but not so hot that it wastes precious fuel. She makes ale, the weak beer that everyone drinks, in a large barrel in the corner of the house. It's a complicated process involving malting grain, boiling it with water and herbs, letting it ferment for several days. She has to do this every week or two because the ale doesn't keep long. She tends the vegetable garden behind the house, growing onions and leeks and cabbages and beans. She feeds the chickens and collects their eggs. She milks the cow you share with 2 other families. She makes butter and cheese from the milk. She does all the laundry, which means hauling water from the well, heating it over the fire, scrubbing clothes against rocks or a washboard, rinsing them and hanging them to dry. She makes and repairs all the clothes your family wears, spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into cloth, cutting and sewing the cloth into tunics and hose and shifts. These are skills that take years to learn, passed down from mother to daughter through generations. And she does all of this while also raising children if you have any, which most families do. Medieval women spend much of their adult lives pregnant or nursing. Babies are born at home, with Agnes the healer or another experienced woman assisting. There are no painkillers, no epidurals, no hospitals. Women die in childbirth regularly, and everyone knows someone who's lost a wife or mother this way. The babies who survive face their own challenges. Maybe half die before age 5, victims of disease or accidents, or simply being born too weak to thrive in this harsh world. Watching your wife work, you gain a new appreciation for how much labor goes into simply surviving in medieval times. In your old world, you probably thought of medieval life as simple, even primitive, but the reality is that it's incredibly complex, requiring a vast array of skills and knowledge that most modern people don't have. Your wife can spin and weave and sew and cook and brew food and preserve food and tend animals and a dozen other things. You can plow and plant and harvest and thresh and winnow and a dozen other things. Together, you have the skills necessary to keep yourselves alive, barely, if nothing goes wrong.
But things do go wrong. That's a constant in medieval life. The weather is unpredictable, and bad weather means bad harvests, which means hunger. Animals get sick and die. Buildings catch fire and burn down, taking everything you own with them. Bandits or soldiers passing through steal what they can and destroy what they can't carry. Life in medieval times is precarious, always balanced on a knife's edge between survival and disaster. As summer progresses and you're back to work in the fields, you begin to understand the agricultural cycle that governs everything in this world. Spring is for plowing and planting. Summer is for tending the crops, weeding and watering, and
praying for the right balance of sun and rain. Fall is for the harvest, the most important time of the year, when everyone works from dawn until well past dark to bring in the crops before the weather turns. And winter is for surviving on what you've managed to store away, repairing tools and buildings, and hoping your supplies last until spring. The harvest is approaching now, and there's a tension in the air. You can see it in how people look at the fields, evaluating the wheat and barley and oats. Is it a good crop this year? Will there be enough? The weather has been decent, not too wet and not too dry, and the crops look healthy. But you never really know until you bring it in and thresh it and see how much grain you actually have. And even if it's a good harvest for you, you'll owe a portion to the Lord as rent, and the church will expect its tithe, 1/10 of everything you produce, and what's left has to feed your family for an entire year. The harvest begins on a morning in late August when Father Benedict blesses the fields, and everyone picks up their sickles and begins to cut. The sickle is a simple tool, a curved blade attached to a wooden handle, and you use it to cut the grain stalks near the base. It's back-breaking work, bending over constantly, grabbing bunches of stalks with one hand and cutting with the other. The cut stalks are gathered into sheaves, tied together with pieces of straw twisted into rope, and the sheaves are stood up in the field to dry. Everyone works during harvest, men and women and children old enough to hold a tool. The Lord even provides food and ale to the workers, better food than usual, because he needs everyone working as hard as they can for as long as they can. There's a race against time. If the weather holds and you get the harvest in safely, everyone eats this winter. If it rains and the grain gets wet and rots in the fields, people will starve. It's that simple and that terrifying. You work until your hands blister and your back screams in protest. You work until you're so tired you can barely stand, and then you work some more. Around you, people sing work songs to keep the rhythm and maintain morale. The songs are old, probably ancient, passed down through so many generations that nobody remembers who first sang them. They're about love and loss and hard work and better days to come, and they're sung in that Middle English that still sounds half foreign to your ears. At night, you collapse into bed and sleep like the dead, and in the morning, you get up and do it all over again. This continues for weeks until all the grain is cut and dried and brought to the barns. Then comes the threshing, beating the grain stalks with flails to separate the grain from the chaff. Then the winnowing, throwing the grain into the air so the wind blows away the lighter chaff and the heavier grain falls back down. Every step is labor-intensive and time-consuming, and now you understand why so much of medieval life revolved around getting enough food to eat. By the time the harvest is finally in, it's late September. The days are getting shorter and cooler. The leaves are starting to turn color, yellows and oranges and reds that seem impossibly bright against the deep blue sky. There's a harvest festival, a day of celebration where work is set aside and everyone comes together to give thanks for another year survived, another harvest brought in, another winter faced with supplies of grain and preserved food. The festival is held on the village green, and it's the highlight of the social calendar. The Lord has provided several pigs to be roasted, and the smell of roasting meat fills the air, making everyone's mouth water. There's fresh bread made from wheat flour, a rare treat for peasants who usually eat rye or barley bread. There's cheese and butter and vegetables from everyone's gardens, and there's ale, lots of ale, stronger than the weak stuff you drink every day, and people drink it freely and start to get loud and happy. Musicians appear, wandering performers who travel from village to village, playing instruments you recognize and some you don't. There's a bagpipe making a droning, wailing sound that somehow fits this landscape perfectly. There's a fiddle, played with more enthusiasm than skill. There's a drum that keeps a steady beat. People dance, not formal dances with steps and patterns, but wild, energetic stomping and jumping that's more about releasing energy than any kind of artistry.
You find yourself swept up in it, dancing with your wife and your neighbors, laughing at stupid jokes, eating until you're uncomfortably full, because who knows when you'll have this much good food again. Young people flirt in the shadows at the edge of the firelight. Children run around in packs, playing games that seem to have no rules. Old people sit on benches and watch and remember when they were young and strong enough to dance all night. And then, as the fire burns down and people start to drift toward home, you hear something that makes you stop and listen. Father Benedict is making an announcement. There's news from London, from the King's Court. War with France is going badly. Taxes are being raised. And there's talk of something else, something worse. Plague in the eastern ports. Ships arriving from overseas with dead sailors. People dying in their homes, covered in black boils, coughing up blood. The mood shifts immediately. The laughter and music stop. People make the sign of the cross and mutter prayers. Everyone knows about plague. It's happened before, though not in anyone's living memory. But the stories are passed down. Tales of villages emptied, of bodies piled in the streets, of priests who wouldn't even perform burial rites for fear of catching the disease. And now it might be coming again. Father Benedict tries to reassure everyone. London is far away, more than 100 miles. The plague might not spread this far. And even if it does, the church will protect the faithful. Pray to Saint Sebastian, who protects against plague. Confess your sins and receive the sacraments. Trust in God's mercy. But you can see the fear in people's faces, the worry in their eyes, and you feel it too, a cold knot of anxiety in your stomach. The festival ends early, and people drift home in small, quiet groups. The celebration has turned somber, and that night, lying in bed listening to the wind outside, you wonder if you've just experienced the last carefree moment this village will know for a very long time. The weeks pass, and life continues its normal rhythms, but there's an undercurrent of worry now. Every traveler who passes through is questioned. Have you seen the plague? How far has it spread? Is it coming this way? The answers are contradictory and confusing. Some travelers say the plague is everywhere, killing thousands. Others say it's been contained to the ports. Nobody knows what to believe. And then, in late October, as the first frost touches the fields and people are preparing for winter, a merchant arrives in the village. He's traveling from London to York, and he stops to trade goods and gather supplies. He's a well-dressed man, prosperous, riding a good horse and accompanied by 2 servants. He sets up his wares in the village square, cloth and metal goods and spices, luxury items that most villagers can't afford but like to look at anyway. People gather around, asking him about news from the wider world. He's happy to share what he knows. The war in France is indeed going badly. The king needs more money, more soldiers. Taxes will be heavy this year. But he waves away questions about the plague. That's all exaggerated, he says. A few people got sick in some ports, but it's nothing to worry about. London is fine. Life goes on as normal. People want to believe him, and so they do. The fear that's been hanging over the village for weeks starts to lift. Maybe it was all just rumors and panic. Maybe the plague isn't coming at all. The merchant does good business, and he stays the night at the manor house as the Lord's guest before continuing his journey north. 3 days later, one of his servants falls ill. The man had been staying at an inn in the next village over, and the innkeeper sends word that the servant is sick and raving with fever. Nobody thinks much of it at first. People get sick all the time. But then the innkeeper's wife falls ill. Then 2 of the guests at the inn. Then people in that village, one after another, falling sick with terrifying speed. The symptoms are distinctive and horrifying. High fever that comes on suddenly, making people delirious and weak. Swollen lymph nodes in the neck, armpits and groin, growing to the size of eggs or even apples, turning black and oozing pus. Coughing that brings up blood. Purple-black spots appearing on the skin. And death, usually within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms, sometimes even faster. The plague has arrived. Word spreads through your village like wildfire. Father Benedict calls everyone to the church for an emergency mass. He tells you to confess your sins and pray for God's mercy. He tells you to avoid the sick, to stay in your homes as much as possible.
He tells you that this is a punishment from God for humanity's sins, and the only defense is faith and prayer. Some of the more practical-minded villagers suggest avoiding the next village over entirely, not traveling there or trading with them. But Father Benedict says that shows a lack of faith. If God wants you to die, you'll die. If he wants you to live, you'll live. Human precautions are meaningless in the face of divine will. Not everyone agrees with this theology, but nobody wants to say that out loud. Questioning the church's teachings is dangerous. So people pray and hope and try to go about their normal business. But there's a pall over everything now, a sense of doom hanging in the air like smoke.
The first case in your village appears a week later. It's Thomas the blacksmith, the strong, healthy man who seemed invincible. He complains of feeling tired and feverish in the morning. By evening, he's bedridden, burning with fever. By the next morning, the characteristic swellings have appeared in his armpits and groin, and everyone knows what this means. Thomas has the plague, and if Thomas can get it, anyone can. His wife and children flee the house, moving in with relatives, abandoning Thomas to his fate. Agnes the healer won't go near him. Nobody will. He lies alone in his house, crying out for water, for help, for his wife, but nobody comes. You can hear his screams from your house, growing weaker over the next 2 days, and then falling silent. When people finally work up the courage to check on him, they find him dead, his body already starting to rot, covered in the black boils that gave the plague its name. Nobody wants to touch the body. Finally, 2 young men volunteer, motivated by a promised payment from the manor. They wear cloth masks soaked in vinegar, which people believe protects against the plague vapors. They wrap Thomas's body in a sheet, load it onto a cart, and take it to the churchyard. Father Benedict won't perform a full funeral mass, just a quick burial with minimal ceremony. The 2 young men who handled the body are regarded with a mixture of pity and fear, and people avoid them, waiting to see if they'll fall ill. They don't, at least not right away, but others do. Thomas's wife and children, despite fleeing, all fall sick within days. The blacksmith's house becomes a place of horror, with 3 bodies lying inside, dead and rotting, because now nobody will go near it at all. Other cases appear, scattered through the village. Old William, the lazy farmer, young Alice, who was courting Richard, Father Benedict himself, who insisted on performing his priestly duties despite the danger, giving last rites to the dying and consoling the living. The social fabric of the village begins to unravel. People stop going to church, afraid of being in an enclosed space with others. The fields go unattended because nobody wants to work in groups. Neighbors avoid each other. Families barricade themselves in their homes, refusing to open their doors even to close friends. The few people still healthy enough to work begin burying the dead in mass graves, no longer bothering with individual burials or Christian rites. There are simply too many bodies and too few people willing to deal with them. You and your wife stay in your house as much as possible, only going out when absolutely necessary. You eat the stored grain and preserved food you put away from the harvest, trying to make it last, because nobody knows how long this will go on. The village is quiet now, eerily quiet. No more sounds of children playing or people calling to each other or the normal buzz of human activity. Just silence, broken occasionally by the sound of someone crying or coughing or crying out in fever dreams. And then your wife falls ill. It starts with a complaint of feeling tired, nothing unusual given the stress and fear everyone's living with. But by evening, she's burning with fever, and by the next morning, the swellings have appeared. You know what this means. You've seen it enough times now to recognize the signs. Your wife, your companion in this strange medieval life, the woman who's cooked your meals and mended your clothes and shared your bed, is going to die. She's terrified, and so are you. She begs you not to leave her alone, and you promise you won't, even though you know this means you'll probably catch the plague too.
You stay by her side, holding her hand, giving her water when she can drink, wiping the sweat from her forehead, talking to her even when she's too delirious to understand. You pray to every saint you can think of, making bargains with God that you'll do anything, give anything, if he'll just let her live. But God doesn't answer. Or maybe he does, and the answer is no. She suffers for 3 days, growing weaker, the swellings turning blacker, blood leaking from her nose and mouth. On the 3rd night, she has a moment of clarity. The fever breaks briefly, and she opens her eyes and looks at you and really sees you. She squeezes your hand and tries to say something, but she's too weak. You lean closer, and she whispers 3 words. Thank you. Goodbye. And then she's gone, slipping away so quietly you almost don't realize it's happened. You sit there for a long time, holding the hand of a dead woman in a world that's not your own, feeling more alone than you've ever felt in your life. Eventually, you lay her body out properly, crossing her hands over her chest, closing her eyes. You should get someone to help bury her, but you can't bring yourself to leave her yet. You spend the night sitting beside her body, waiting for the fever to take you too, because surely you must have caught it by now. But morning comes, and you're still healthy.
Days pass. You wait for the symptoms, but they don't come. For reasons you don't understand and can't explain, you're not going to get sick. Maybe you had it before, in your other life, your real life, and your modern immune system carries antibodies that protect you. Or maybe you're just lucky, one of those rare people who are naturally resistant. It doesn't really matter why. What matters is that you're alive and she's dead, and eventually you have to do something about that. You dig a grave in the small plot behind your house, next to the vegetable garden she tended. It takes most of a day because you're weak from grief and hunger, and you haven't been doing much physical work lately. You wrap her body in the best cloth you have and lower her into the ground. There's no priest to say prayers, Father Benedict having died a week ago, so you say what you remember of the funeral service, the words stumbling and uncertain. You fill in the grave and mark it with a simple wooden cross, and then you go inside and cry for the first time since you arrived in this medieval world. Great wrenching sobs that shake your entire body. The plague continues for weeks, then months. Winter comes, and that seems to slow it down. The cold weather and the fact that people are staying inside anyway. By Christmas, which nobody celebrates this year, the dying has mostly stopped. Not because the plague is gone, but because there's hardly anyone left to die. Your village of 200 souls is now home to maybe 60 people. Bodies lie unburied in houses that nobody will enter. The church stands empty. Fields that took generations to clear are already starting to revert to wilderness. If you're still listening to this story, taking this journey through one of humanity's darkest times, remember that this isn't just history. These were real people, living real lives, experiencing real loss. And if you're finding peace in this story as you drift towards sleep, consider leaving a comment, sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more historically accurate journeys like this one. But for now, let's continue with the aftermath of the plague, because in some ways, that's when the real changes begin. The survivors gather on a cold January morning. There are maybe 50 people left from your village, and similar numbers from the neighboring villages. Someone needs to take charge, to figure out how to rebuild, how to survive. With the Lord dead and the steward dead, and most of the social structure collapsed, people look to each other with a new wariness and a new equality. The old rules don't seem to apply anymore. John the Miller, one of the few prosperous villagers who survived, calls a meeting. People gather in the church, one of the few buildings that still feels safe. He proposes that the survivors band together, share resources, work cooperatively to bring in this year's crop.
Some of the land can be abandoned, he says. There aren't enough people to work it all anyway. They'll focus on the best fields, the ones that produce the most with the least labor. Someone points out that the Lord's lands should be worked first, as rent is still owed. But John counters that the Lord is dead, and so is his son, and nobody knows who the rightful heir is. It might be months or years before someone shows up to claim the manor. In the meantime, why should they break their backs working land that benefits someone who isn't even here? Why not work their own lands first, ensure their own survival, and worry about rent later? This is revolutionary talk, borderline treason, and a year ago nobody would have dared suggest it. But the plague has changed everything. The old certainties are gone. God himself seemed to abandon his people, letting the just and unjust die with equal frequency. The church's promises of protection through faith proved empty. The social hierarchy that seemed ordained by God collapsed in the face of a disease that killed lords and peasants alike. People are questioning things they never questioned before. They vote, something that would have been unthinkable in the old system. Each surviving household gets one vote on how to proceed. It's a strange, halting process, nobody quite sure how it should work, but eventually a consensus emerges. They'll work cooperatively, they'll share resources, they'll worry about rent and obligations later, if ever. For now, survival is all that matters. Over the next few months, a new society begins to emerge from the ruins of the old. With so much land and so few workers, labor is suddenly valuable in a way it never was before. In the old world, lords could pick and choose among dozens of peasants desperate for a small plot to farm. Now, the surviving peasants can pick and choose among hundreds of empty plots. They take the best land, the fields closest to water, the ones with the richest soil. They abandon the marginal land that was barely worth farming even in good times. Travelers start passing through again as the plague recedes, and they bring news from the wider world. The plague killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of all people in Europe. Entire villages stand empty. Cities are half deserted. The economy is in chaos. But there's also opportunity. With so few workers available, wages are rising dramatically. Peasants who once worked for a few pennies a day are demanding shillings. Lords are competing for laborers, offering better terms, more freedom, higher pay.
The English government tries to stop this, passing laws that freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid peasants from moving to find better work. But the laws are impossible to enforce when there aren't enough officials left alive to enforce them. Peasants ignore the laws, and lords who need labor are forced to break them or watch their fields go unplanted. You find yourself with options you never had before. A lord from 2 villages over sends word that he's looking for farmers to work his land. He's offering better terms than you've ever heard of. Lower rents, more freedom, even the possibility of becoming a free tenant rather than a tied villein. You consider it, but you also consider something else. With your house and land here, with the memory of your wife buried in the garden, you have roots in this place now. This is your home, strange as that would have seemed when you first arrived. You decide to stay, but on your own terms. You expand your holdings, taking over 3 abandoned farms that border your property. Nobody's going to stop you. There's no lord to object, no steward to collect rent. You're effectively a free farmer now, working land you've claimed for yourself. It's more work than one person should handle, but you hire young Richard, who survived the plague along with his sweetheart Alice. They're married now, a quick ceremony performed by a priest passing through, and they're happy to work for you in exchange for a share of the harvest. Spring arrives, and you plow and plant more land than you ever thought possible. Richard is strong and willing. Alice helps with the household work, and together the 3 of you manage to get a decent crop in the ground. It's hard work, but there's a satisfaction to it that you never felt in the old days when you were working the Lord's land as an obligation. This is your land, your crop.
your future. For the first time since arriving in this medieval world, you feel like you have some control over your destiny. The summer is peaceful, at least by medieval standards. The crops grow well, the weather cooperates, no plague, no war, no disasters. People slowly begin to rebuild their lives, though nothing will ever be quite the same as it was before. The church sends a new priest, a young man named Peter, who's more practical than theological, willing to bend the rules when necessary to help his flock. He performs marriages and baptisms and burials, and he doesn't ask too many questions about whose land is whose or who owes what to whom. In August, as you're bringing in your harvest, a nobleman arrives in the village. He's the new lord, a nephew of the old lord, come to claim his inheritance. He brings soldiers with him, a show of force meant to intimidate. He calls a meeting and announces that things will return to the way they were before the plague. Rents will be paid, labor will be owed, the old obligations will be enforced. The villagers look at each other, and you can see the calculation in their eyes. They could resist. There are more of them than there are soldiers, but the nobleman has the law on his side and the power of the church, and eventually soldiers can summon more soldiers. Rebellion would be dangerous, probably futile, but neither are they willing to just surrender everything they've gained over the past year. John the miller, speaking for the group, explains the situation. Many of the old obligations are impossible to meet because there aren't enough people. The fields that are being worked efficiently and well. The harvest will be good this year, better than expected given how few farmers survived. Surely the Lord would prefer a smaller rent from land that's actually productive, rather than insisting on the old obligations that can't be met. The nobleman isn't happy, but he's practical enough to recognize reality. After days of negotiation, a compromise is reached. Rents will be paid, but at a lower rate than before the plague. Labor obligations are reduced. Some of the abandoned land is officially released from feudal obligations, allowing peasants to farm it as free tenants. It's not everything the villagers wanted, but it's more freedom than they had before the plague. The Black Death, for all its horror, has cracked the foundations of the feudal system in ways that will never fully be repaired. Life settles into a new rhythm. You're no longer quite a peasant in the old sense, though you're not free either. You're something in between, and that in-between space is where most of society will move over the coming decades. You farm your land, pay your rents, and live your life with a bit more autonomy than you had before the plague. Richard and Alice build their own house on one of the plots you claimed, and their first child is born the following spring. You become godfather to the baby, a role that binds you to this family and this community in ways that are both comforting and constraining. Years pass. You never fully adjust to medieval life, not really. You still dream sometimes of your old world, of electric lights and running water and all the conveniences you took for granted. You miss things you never thought you'd miss: ice cream, hot showers, being able to travel more than 10 miles from home, talking to people who share your cultural references. But those memories fade gradually, like a photograph left in the sun, until sometimes you wonder if they were ever real or just strange dreams.
You grow older in this medieval world. Your body's shaped by hard labor and basic food and the absence of modern medicine. Your hands are gnarled and calloused. Your back is permanently bent from decades of stooping over crops. You've lost most of your teeth. You probably won't live past 60, and you're okay with that because you've seen 60-year-olds in this world, and they're ancient, used up, ready for rest. You remarry eventually, a widow named Joan, who lost her husband and children to the plague. It's not a love match, not at first. It's practical. Two people are stronger than one. She needs someone to work the land. You need someone to manage the household. But over time, something like affection grows between you. You'll never love her the way you loved your first wife, but you're companions, partners in the hard business of survival. And that counts for something. You have children.
2 daughters who survive infancy out of 4 pregnancies. You watch them grow up in a world that's slowly changing. They have more options than their grandparents did. The eldest marries a free tenant farmer and moves to another village. The youngest enters a convent, one of the few paths to education and independence available to medieval women. You're proud of them both, though you rarely say so because emotional vulnerability isn't something medieval men are supposed to display. The decades pass, measured not by clocks but by harvests, by the cycle of seasons, by the rhythm of life and death that governs all things in this world. You see the village slowly recover from the plague, population growing as families have children, and some of those children survive. You see the slow erosion of feudal obligations as peasants gain more bargaining power. You see the beginning of what historians will later call the late Middle Ages, a time of transition and change. You grow old, and one winter morning you wake up and know that this is the day. Your body is tired, used up, ready to stop. Joan sits beside your bed, holding your hand the way you once held your first wife's hand. Your daughters are there, and their children, and Richard and Alice, who've become like family. Father Peter comes to give you last rites, the ritual words of comfort that the church offers to the dying. And as you lie there, drifting in and out of consciousness, you think about the strange journey your life has been. You woke up in a world that wasn't yours, lived a life that shouldn't have been yours, and now you're dying a death that belongs to someone else. But somewhere along the way, this life became yours after all. These people, this land, this hard, dirty, beautiful medieval world became your home. Your last thoughts aren't of the world you left behind. They're of the spring planting that will need to be done soon, of your daughters and their families, of the small piece of earth where you'll be buried next to Joan when her time comes. You've lived a life that mattered to the people around you, and in the end, isn't that all anyone can ask for? And now, as you listen to this story in your comfortable bed in the 21st century, I hope you found some peace in this journey through time. If you enjoyed this historical experience and want more stories like it, please subscribe to Dreamless Timelines, hit that like button, and leave a comment about where in history you'd like to visit next. These stories are created for you, to help you find rest at the end of a long day, to give your mind something to focus on besides your worries and stress. But let's not end there. Let's talk about the bigger picture, about what life in medieval times really meant beyond just one person's experience. Because understanding the medieval world helps us understand our own world, helps us appreciate the progress we've made and recognize the challenges that remain. Medieval society was built on agriculture in a way that modern people struggle to comprehend. Roughly 90% of the population worked the land, and everything else, the churches and castles and kings and wars, was built on the surplus produced by those farmers. It was a precarious system, always one bad harvest away from famine, one epidemic away from collapse, and yet it persisted for centuries, slowly evolving, gradually improving. The medieval period, that long stretch of time between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, wasn't actually the Dark Ages that popular culture sometimes portrays. Yes, life was hard. Yes, technology was primitive by our standards. Yes, people died of diseases we now prevent with simple vaccines. But there was also innovation and creativity and progress, just slower and less dramatic than the changes we're used to.
Medieval farmers developed the three-field system of crop rotation, which improved yields and soil quality. They invented the heavy plow, which could break up the thick clay soils of northern Europe. They figured out how to breed better horses and oxen, how to clear forests and drain marshes, how to build windmills and water mills that could grind grain more efficiently than human or animal power. These weren't dramatic breakthroughs like the invention of the internet.
but they were the small, incremental improvements that allowed more people to survive, that built the foundation for later development. Medieval society also developed institutions that would shape the modern world. The university system began in medieval times, starting as informal gatherings of scholars and evolving into formal institutions of learning. The legal system, with its emphasis on precedent and written law, has medieval roots. The concept of representative government, the idea that people should have some say in how they're governed, began to emerge in medieval parliaments and assemblies. Even the scientific method, the systematic approach to understanding the natural world, has its origins in medieval natural philosophy. But medieval life was also brutal in ways we can barely imagine. Violence was common. A dispute over property boundaries might end in murder. Executions were public spectacles. Torture was an accepted part of the legal system. People were burned alive for heresy or witchcraft. Children were beaten as a normal part of discipline. Domestic violence was accepted, even expected. The idea that every human being has inherent worth and deserves respect regardless of their birth or status was not a medieval concept. The church dominated medieval life in ways that went beyond religion. It controlled education, art, music, literature, philosophy. It owned vast amounts of land and wielded enormous political power. It dictated when people could marry, what they could eat on Fridays, how they should think about sex and love and death. The church's authority was absolute, backed by the threat of excommunication, which meant not just exclusion from religious services, but social death, being cut off from the community and all its support systems. Yet people found ways to live within and around these constraints. They developed elaborate folk traditions that existed alongside official Christianity. They told stories and sang songs that had little to do with church teaching. They found moments of joy and beauty in a hard world, in a sunny day or a good harvest or a baby's laugh. They loved and fought and dreamed just like people always have throughout all of human history. The plague, the Black Death that features so prominently in our story, was one of the defining events of the medieval period. It killed between 75 and 200 million people in Eurasia, peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1353. In some regions, it wiped out up to 60% of the population. Entire villages were abandoned, economic systems collapsed, social hierarchies were upended. The trauma was so deep that it changed European culture in fundamental ways. But the plague also had long-term effects that weren't entirely negative. The shortage of labor gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Wages dramatically rose. Serfdom began to decline as lords competed for workers. The rigid social hierarchy of feudalism started to crack. People began to question traditional authorities and beliefs. The church's power was weakened by its failure to protect people from the plague. Seeds were planted for the social changes that would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the modern world. If you're still awake, still following this journey through medieval history, I want to thank you for staying with me this long. These long-form historical narratives are designed to give your mind something to focus on, to crowd out the worries and anxieties that might otherwise keep you awake. If this story is helping you relax, helping you drift towards sleep, then it's doing its job. And if you want more content like this, remember to subscribe to Dreamless Timelines and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new historical journey. Now, let's talk about daily life in a bit more detail, because the devil, as they say, is in the details, and it's those small details that really bring history to life. Food in medieval times was a constant concern, the thing around which everything else revolved. The diet of a typical peasant was monotonous and lacking in many nutrients: bread, pottage, occasional cheese, rare meat, vegetables like cabbages, onions, leeks, and peas, fruit when in season, though most fruit went to making cider or wine because those kept better than fresh fruit, fish on Fridays and during Lent, when the church forbade eating meat. The lack of refrigeration meant that food preservation was crucial. Meat was salted or smoked, fish were dried or salted, vegetables were pickled or stored in root cellars. Grain was kept in sealed containers to protect it from rodents and insects. Despite these efforts, food spoilage was common, and people regularly ate things that were partially rotten or moldy. Food poisoning was a frequent occurrence, though people didn't understand what caused it. Malnutrition was widespread, especially in late winter and early spring, the hungry months when last year's harvest was running low and this year's crops weren't ready yet. People would eat things they normally wouldn't: tree bark, grass, even clay to fill their stomachs. Famines occurred regularly whenever harvests failed, and during famines, people starved. It's estimated that in a typical medieval lifetime, a person would experience several years of serious food shortage. Hygiene, as we've mentioned, was primitive. People bathed occasionally, maybe once a month or less, in water heated over the fire and poured into a wooden tub. The whole family would use the same water, one after another, starting with the head of the household and ending with the youngest children. By the time the last person got in, the water was cold and filthy. Soap existed, but expensive, made from animal fat and wood ash. Most people just rinsed with water and called it good enough. Teeth were cleaned by rubbing them with a cloth, sometimes dipped in salt or herbs. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no fluoride treatments. Dental decay was universal. By age 30, most people had lost several teeth. By 40, many were missing most of their teeth, making it difficult to eat anything that required chewing. This led to a reliance on soft foods like pottage and bread soaked in broth, which further limited nutritional options.
Clothing was handmade and rarely washed because washing wore out the fabric quickly, and fabric was expensive. People wore the same clothes day after day, week after week, only changing for special occasions or when their clothes literally fell apart. Undergarments existed, simple linen shifts worn next to the skin, and these were washed more frequently than outer garments, but still only every few weeks at best. The smell of unwashed bodies and clothes was so universal that nobody really noticed it anymore. Lice were a constant companion. Everyone had them, from the richest lord to the poorest peasant. People would sit and pick lice from each other's hair, crushing them between fingernails, a social activity that served the dual purpose of grooming and bonding. Fleas were equally common, living in the straw mattresses and woolen blankets, biting constantly. People developed a certain tolerance for itching, learning to ignore the constant sensation of something crawling on their skin. The houses people lived in were small and dark and smoky. Windows were small to conserve heat, and most had no glass, just wooden shutters that could be closed against wind and rain. This meant a choice between light and warmth, or darkness and protection from the elements. In winter, people chose warmth, keeping shutters closed, living in near darkness illuminated only by the fire. The smoke from the fire had no proper chimney in most peasant houses, just a hole in the roof, so the interior was constantly hazy with smoke. This smoke actually helped preserve the roof timbers and keep insects away, but it also left everyone with chronic respiratory problems. Furniture was minimal: a table, some benches or stools, maybe a chest for storing valuables. Beds were straw mattresses on wooden frames, shared by the entire family. Privacy didn't exist in the modern sense. Everyone could see and hear everything everyone else was doing. Married couples had sex while children slept a few feet away. People urinated in chamber pots in full view of their families. The concept of personal space was foreign to medieval people. Animals often lived in the house as well, at least in winter. Chickens might roost in the rafters. A pig might be penned in a corner. Larger animals like cows and horses lived in a separate area, but often under the same roof, their body heat helping warm the human living space. The smell was intense, a mixture of animal dung, human waste, smoke, unwashed bodies, and rotting straw.
Visitors from the modern world would find it literally nauseating, but to medieval people, it was just how life smelled. Disease was ever present, beyond just the plague. Smallpox scarred many survivors, leaving their faces pitted and marked. Measles killed children regularly. Whooping cough, diphtheria, scarlet fever all took their toll on the young. Dysentery and cholera spread through contaminated water. Tuberculosis slowly consumed people over months or years. Leprosy, while not as common as people often think, was still present, and lepers were forced to live outside communities, ringing bells to warn of their approach. Parasites were universal. Intestinal worms infected most people, causing malnutrition and digestive problems. Tapeworms could grow to enormous lengths inside the human gut. Liver flukes, picked up from contaminated water or undercooked fish, caused serious illness. People accepted these parasites as a normal part of life, occasionally purging themselves with herbal remedies that were as likely to harm as help. Mental illness was poorly understood and often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. People who today would be diagnosed with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder were seen as possessed by demons and might be subjected to exorcism or beaten to drive the demons out. Depression was seen as sloth or insufficient faith. Anxiety was weakness. The only treatments available were prayer, pilgrimage to holy sites, or herbal remedies that rarely helped. Childhood in medieval times was both cherished and harsh. Parents loved their children, but they also understood that many wouldn't survive. Infant mortality was around 30%. Another 20% of children died before age 10. This led to a certain emotional distance, a protective mechanism against the pain of losing children. Parents invested less emotionally in very young children, knowing the odds were against their survival. Names were often recycled, with new babies given the names of dead siblings. Children who survived infancy were put to work as soon as they were able. By age 5 or 6, children were helping with household chores, tending animals, watching younger siblings. By age 10, they were doing adult work, though less of it. There was no concept of childhood as a special protected time of life. Children were seen as small adults who needed to learn skills as quickly as possible so they could contribute to the family's survival.
Education for peasant children was almost non-existent. Reading and writing were skills for clergy and nobles, not common folk. Children learned through observation and apprenticeship, watching their parents work and gradually taking on more responsibilities. Boys learned their father's trade. Girls learned housewifery from their mothers. This system was effective for passing down practical skills, but left people functionally illiterate and innumerate, unable to read contracts or calculate complex amounts, making them vulnerable to exploitation by those who could. Marriage typically happened in the late teens or early 20s, later than popular culture often suggests. People couldn't afford to marry until they had some means of supporting themselves, usually inheriting or leasing land. Marriages were arranged by families, though children usually had some say in the matter. Love was nice if it happened, but wasn't expected. Marriage was primarily an economic arrangement, combining resources and labor to create a viable household. The wedding ceremony was simple. The couple would gather with friends and family at the church door, where they would exchange vows in front of witnesses. This public declaration was the crucial element. The priest would bless the union, but the marriage was actually created by the couple's consent, not by church ritual. After the church door ceremony, there would be a celebration, drinking and dancing and feasting if the families could afford it. Then the couple would be escorted to their new home with much bawdy joking about the wedding night. Sex was a complicated topic in medieval times. The church taught that sex was primarily for procreation, that pleasure in sex was sinful, that sex should only occur between married couples and only in certain positions at certain times. Sex during menstruation was forbidden. Sex during pregnancy was forbidden. Sex on Sundays and holy days was forbidden. Sex during Lent was forbidden. If you followed all the church's rules, There were only about 4 days a month when sex was permissible. Of course, people didn't follow these rules. They had sex when they wanted to, in ways they found pleasurable, with relatively little guilt despite what the church taught. Bastard children were common, though they faced social stigma and legal discrimination. Prostitution existed in every town and city, officially condemned but unofficially tolerated. Homosexuality existed, though it was dangerous to be caught, as sodomy was considered a serious crime punishable by death. Women's sexuality was particularly constrained. A woman's virginity before marriage was crucial, as her value in the marriage market depended partly on her being unspoiled. After marriage, a woman was expected to submit to her husband's sexual demands, but not to express her own desires. Women who enjoyed sex were viewed with suspicion, potentially even as witches. Yet women found ways to express their sexuality, to find pleasure, to have affairs, despite the social and legal constraints. Let me share with you more about what you'd experience as the years continued to roll by in this medieval world, because time here moves differently than you remember. Without clocks marking every hour, without calendars dividing years into precise units, time becomes more fluid, measured by natural cycles and human events rather than numerical precision. The seasons dominate your sense of time. Spring with its mud and planting and baby animals, summer with its long days and growing crops and preparation for harvest, fall with its frantic rush to bring in the crops before weather turns, winter with its cold and darkness and constant worry about whether supplies will last. These cycles repeat year after year until they become the rhythm of your life, as reliable and unchanging as your own heartbeat. Religious festivals provide another way of marking time. Christmas, the biggest celebration, though it lasts for 12 days, not just one. Epiphany on January 6th, when the three kings visited baby Jesus. Candlemas on February 2nd, when candles are blessed for the coming year. Easter, the most important holiday theologically, though its date changes every year based on complex calculations involving the moon. Pentecost, 50 days after Easter. The Feast of St. John on Midsummer. Michaelmas on September 29th, when rents are due and accounts are settled. All Saints' Day on November 1st, when the dead are remembered. These festivals break up the monotony of work, providing moments of rest and celebration. They also serve practical purposes, marking when certain tasks should be done, when payments are due, when legal terms begin and end. In a world without calendars, these religious festivals serve as a shared timekeeping system that everyone understands. You begin to notice other aspects of medieval life that you missed at first, small details that reveal how different this world really is. The pace of life, for instance, is both slower and more variable than you're used to. When there's work to do, everyone works from sunrise to sunset, pushing hard because the work won't wait. But when there's no pressing work, people are remarkably idle, sitting and talking for hours, watching the world go by, not feeling the need to be productive every moment.
The concept of productivity itself is different. Nobody's trying to maximize efficiency or optimize their workflow. People work hard when they must, but they also believe strongly in rest and celebration. There are dozens of religious holidays throughout the year when work is forbidden, and people take these seriously. The idea that you should work constantly to get ahead, to accumulate wealth, to improve your position, that's not a medieval concept. You work to survive, and once you're surviving, you rest and enjoy what you have. Information travels slowly in this world. News of major events, battles or royal deaths or important church pronouncements might take weeks or months to reach your village. And when it does arrive, it comes through travelers or wandering performers or merchants, filtered through multiple retellings, mixed with rumor and speculation. You have no way to verify what you're hearing, no way to check facts or get different perspectives. You believe what you're told, or you don't, based on the trustworthiness of the teller and your own intuition. This creates a world where rumors and legends flourish. People believe in dragons and monsters not because they're stupid,
but because they have no way to disprove these beliefs. Someone 3 villages over says they saw a dragon flying over the forest. Well, you haven't been to that forest, and you have no reason to doubt the person, so maybe dragons exist. Stories get embellished with each retelling. Facts blur into fiction, and the line between history and mythology becomes very thin. People believe in magic, not as fantasy, but as reality. They believe that words can have power, that certain rituals can bring good luck or curse enemies, that witches can blight crops or cause impotence, that the phases of the moon affect everything from planting to surgery to when babies are born. These beliefs aren't ignorance exactly. They're attempts to understand and control a world that seems random and chaotic, to find patterns and meaning in events that have no obvious cause. The Church officially condemns many of these beliefs as superstition, but it also promotes its own magical thinking. The consecrated host is literally the body of Christ, transformed by the priest's words. Holy water can ward off evil. Relics of saints have miraculous powers. Pilgrimage to certain shrines can cure disease. The line between church-approved magic and condemned superstition is often thin and inconsistent. You learn to navigate this world of belief and superstition, not because you believe it all, but because everyone around you does, and going along is easier than arguing. You make the sign of the cross when passing the churchyard. You avoid walking under ladders. You throw salt over your shoulder if you spill it. You plant crops according to the moon's phase. These little rituals cost nothing and might help, or at least they won't hurt, so why not? As more years pass, you notice the slow changes happening in the world around you. The village is recovering from the plague, but it's not going back to exactly how it was before. Some changes are obvious. The abandoned houses slowly collapse, their thatch rotting, their walls melting back into the earth. The fields that were cleared by generations of hard labor are reverting to forest, young trees sprouting up where wheat once grew. The village is shrinking physically, consolidating around the remaining inhabited houses, letting the margins go wild. Other changes are more subtle. The social structure is different. With so many of the old families dead, newcomers have moved in, people from other villages looking for land and opportunity. These outsiders don't fit into the traditional hierarchies, don't have generations of relationships and obligations binding them to the community. This creates both tension and opportunity. The old ways are breaking down, but what will replace them isn't yet clear. Labor relations are definitely changing. The Lord still owns the land, still expects rents and services, but the balance of power has shifted. You and the other peasants have options now. If the Lord demands too much, you can threaten to leave, and he knows that replacing you would be difficult or impossible. This gives you leverage you never had before, and you use it carefully and respectfully, but firmly. Rents are negotiated rather than dictated. Labor obligations are reduced. Small freedoms are won inch by inch. The economy is changing too. With fewer people, there's less demand for goods, but there's also less supply. The result is that prices for some things fall, while prices for others rise. Land is cheap, nobody wants it. Labor is expensive, everyone needs it. Grain prices fluctuate wildly depending on how good the harvest was. Manufactured goods, cloth and metal tools and pottery, become more expensive because there are fewer craftsmen to make them. Money becomes more important. In the old days, before the plague, much of the economy ran on barter and labor service. You'd trade eggs for cloth, or work a few days on your neighbor's land in exchange for help with your harvest. Money existed, but wasn't used for most transactions. Now, with the old networks of reciprocal obligation breaking down, people increasingly use coins. This monetization of the economy gives people more freedom, but also more vulnerability. You need money for things you used to get through barter, and if you don't have money, you're in trouble.
You start to see more strangers passing through the village, merchants traveling between towns, craftsmen looking for work.
beggars displaced by the plague, wandering from place to place looking for charity, soldiers returning from wars in France, dangerous men with no trade but violence. The world is becoming more mobile, less stable, less predictable. This is both exciting and frightening. If you're still listening, still drifting on this journey through medieval time, I hope your breathing is slowing, your mind quieting, your body relaxing into sleep. If this story is doing its job, helping you find peace, please take a moment when you wake to like this video and leave a comment. Your engagement helps us create more of these historical journeys. And subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more content designed specifically to help you sleep. But for now, let's continue deeper into this medieval life, exploring corners we haven't yet examined. Technology in medieval times is more sophisticated than you might expect, though still primitive by modern standards. The watermill that grinds grain is a marvel of engineering, using the power of flowing water to turn massive stones that can grind more grain in an hour than a person could grind in a day. The blacksmith's forge, where iron is heated and hammered into tools and horseshoes and weapons, represents centuries of accumulated knowledge about metallurgy and craftsmanship. Even the plow you use in the fields is a complex tool, designed to turn over heavy clay soil more effectively than earlier designs. But progress is slow. Technology improves gradually over generations, not rapidly like you're used to. A plow design might stay unchanged for a century. Building techniques passed down from parent to child remain the same for hundreds of years. This isn't because medieval people are stupid or uncreative. It's because they don't have the infrastructure for rapid innovation. There are no patent systems to protect inventors, no scientific institutions to test and refine ideas, no printing presses to spread knowledge quickly. Improvements happen through random experimentation and word-of-mouth transmission, a much slower process than organized research and development. Travel in medieval times is difficult and dangerous. Roads are terrible, often just dirt tracks that turn to mud in rain. Bridges are rare, meaning rivers must be forded or crossed by ferry. Bandits hide in forests, preying on travelers. The average person never travels more than 10 or 20 miles from their birthplace in their entire life. The world beyond that small radius is foreign territory, filled with people who speak different dialects, follow different customs, and aren't necessarily friendly to outsiders. But some people do travel. Merchants moving goods from town to town, buying cheap and selling dear. Pilgrims visiting holy sites, seeking miracle cures or spiritual merit. Soldiers marching to war, looking for adventure or forced into service by their lords. Wandering laborers seeking better opportunities in the unsettled post-plague economy. These travelers bring news and goods and ideas from distant places, connecting isolated communities to the wider world. You occasionally talk with these travelers, hungry for information about what's happening beyond your narrow horizon. They tell you about London, that enormous city of maybe 40,000 people, though the plague reduced it significantly. They describe stone buildings 3 and 4 stories tall, narrow streets packed with people and animals, markets selling goods from all over Europe and beyond. They talk about the king's court, the great nobles who advise him, the wars in France that have been going on for decades. They mention the universities at Oxford and Cambridge, where scholars study theology and law and medicine, though what practical good this study does is unclear to you. Some travelers tell stranger tales. They've heard of lands far to the east, where people have yellow skin and slanted eyes, of Africa, where the sun is so hot that people's skin turns black, of incredible wealth in eastern cities like Constantinople and Cairo, of spices and silks and precious stones that come from places so distant they might as well be imaginary. These stories fascinate you,
opening up vistas of a world far larger and more diverse than you ever imagined. But they also make you aware of how small and insignificant your village is, just one tiny dot in a vast world you'll never see. Religion continues to dominate life, but your relationship with it evolves. At first, when you arrived in this medieval world, the constant religiosity was oppressive. Church on Sunday, prayers before meals, saints' days and festivals and fasts, the endless invocation of God and Jesus and Mary in everyday conversation. But over time, you begin to understand that religion serves purposes beyond just worship. It provides comfort in a harsh world. It offers explanations for suffering and death. It creates community and shared meaning. It gives people hope that their hard lives have purpose, that there's something better waiting after death.
You become genuinely religious, not in the sense of believing every doctrine literally, but in the sense of finding value in the rituals and community. Sunday Mass becomes a welcome break from work, a chance to sit in the beautiful church and let your mind drift. Prayer becomes a form of meditation, a way to quiet your thoughts and find peace. The stories of saints become inspiring examples of courage and faith in difficult circumstances. You don't question whether it's all literally true. That kind of questioning would be pointless and dangerous. You accept it the way you accept the rising sun, as a fundamental fact of the world you inhabit. But you also see the dark side of religion, the way it's used to control people, to extract money through sales of indulgences and relics of dubious authenticity, the way it enforces conformity, punishing anyone who questions or dissents, the way it validates the social hierarchy, teaching that God ordained the division between nobles and peasants, and that questioning this order is questioning God himself, the way it treats women as inferior, sources of temptation and sin, who need to be controlled by fathers and husbands. Women in medieval society occupy a strange position. They're simultaneously valued and devalued, protected and oppressed. A woman's primary role is to bear children, to continue the family line. This makes young, fertile women valuable, sought after for marriage. But once a woman is past childbearing age, her value drops significantly. Widows, especially childless widows, occupy an ambiguous social position, no longer protected by a husband, but also no longer subject to a husband's control. Women work as hard as men, sometimes harder. They do all the household labor, raise the children, manage the domestic economy. They also work in the fields during busy times like planting and harvest. Some women have trades of their own. They're alewives, brewing and selling beer. They're spinsters, spinning wool into thread, which is where the word for unmarried women comes from, because spinning was so universally done by women. They're midwives, assisting at births. They're healers, using herbal remedies to treat illness. But women have no official power. They can't hold office, can't be priests, can't serve on juries, can't testify in court in most cases. They're legal dependents of their fathers or husbands, unable to own property or sign contracts in their own names. If a woman's husband dies and she has no grown sons, she's in a precarious position, vulnerable to exploitation by male relatives or powerful neighbors. Some women find ways around these restrictions. Wealthy widows can be quite powerful, managing estates and businesses. Abbesses, heads of religious houses, command respect and authority. Even ordinary women exercise power within their households, making decisions about how money is spent and how children are raised. But it's power exercised indirectly, through influence rather than authority, and it's always precarious, always subject to being overridden by men. You think sometimes about the women you knew in your old life, how they would react to this medieval world. Would they rage against the restrictions, find ways to subvert the system? Or would they, like the medieval women around you, accept the limitations of their world and find ways to live meaningful lives within those constraints? You suspect it would be the latter. People are remarkably adaptable, capable of finding happiness even in circumstances that seem intolerable from the outside. The years continue to pass, and you find yourself becoming genuinely medieval in your thinking. You stop comparing everything to your old world,
Stop thinking, in the 21st century we would do this differently. This is your world now, and you think about it on its own terms. When your plow breaks, you don't wish for a tractor. You think about which piece of wood will make the best new handle, and whether you need the blacksmith to forge a new metal part. When you're sick, you don't long for antibiotics. You consider which of Agnes's remedies might help, and whether you should make a pilgrimage to a saint's shrine. Your body has completely adapted to medieval life. You're lean and hard, all muscle and sinew, without an ounce of extra fat. Your hands are so calloused, they're like leather gloves, able to handle rough tools and thorny plants without injury. Your feet have toughened from walking barefoot or in minimal shoes. You can work from sunrise to sunset without the constant fatigue that plagued you at first. You've become, in body at least, a medieval peasant. Your mind has adapted too. You think in terms of seasons and harvests rather than weeks and months. You measure distance in days of walking rather than miles. You judge time by the position of the sun and the length of shadows rather than by clocks. You've learned to read the weather by observing clouds and wind and animal behavior, predictions that are sometimes remarkably accurate. You've developed skills you never knew you needed, the ability to sharpen a scythe, to judge when grain is ready for harvest, to predict how much hay you'll need to feed your cow through winter. You've also lost skills you once had. You no longer do complex math in your head. Calculations that once came easily now confuse you. You've forgotten how to drive a car, operate a computer, use a smartphone. These devices seem like half-remembered dreams, technologies from another world that might never have existed. You've forgotten vast amounts of factual knowledge, things you learned in school about history and science and geography. That knowledge has been replaced by practical skills and local knowledge that's far more useful in this context.
Language has been one of the more interesting adaptations. You speak Middle English now with a local accent, though occasionally a modern word or phrase slips out, causing confused looks from your neighbors. You've stopped noticing the grammatical differences between Middle English and Modern English, stopped being bothered by the different word order and vocabulary. You think in Middle English now, dream in it, and when you try to remember how people talked in your old world, you find those memories hazy and uncertain. You've adopted medieval attitudes and beliefs that would have horrified your former self. You believe in the divine right of kings, that social hierarchy is ordained by God, that some people are born to rule and others to serve. You believe that physical punishment is appropriate for children, servants, and wives who misbehave. You believe that Jews and Muslims are damned because they reject Christ. You believe that the poor are poor because of moral failing, and the rich are rich because God favors them. These beliefs make you uncomfortable when you think about them directly, reminders of the person you used to be, but they're necessary adaptations to fit into this world. One day, working in the field, you realize that you can't remember your original name, the name you had in your old life. You know you had a different name once, but it's gone, erased by years of answering to your medieval name. You try to remember other details from that old life, your parents' faces, where you worked, what you did for fun, but it's all fading like an old photograph, the details becoming indistinct, the emotions attached to those memories growing weaker. You're not sure if you should be disturbed by this or relieved. Maybe it's easier this way, to fully inhabit this life rather than constantly mourning what you've lost. Your children, the daughters you had with Joan, are growing up, and watching them helps you understand medieval childhood in ways you couldn't before. They're children with children's capacity for joy and wonder and imagination, but they're also little adults, bearing responsibilities and facing realities that would be considered inappropriate for children in your old world. Your younger daughter, the one who'll enter a convent, can already spin wool into thread, help with cooking, and manage younger children. She's 9 years old. Your older daughter, now married and living in another village, visits occasionally with her husband and their children. She looks older than her years, worn down by childbearing and hard work, but she seems content with her life.
Her husband treats her well, by medieval standards at least. He doesn't beat her excessively, provides adequate food, and allows her to manage the household as she sees fit. This is considered a good marriage, and you're pleased that she's done well for herself. You have grandchildren now, a strange thought for someone who once had a life in another world, where you might have been younger, might have had different plans. These grandchildren are your legacy, the way you'll be remembered after you die. In a world without photographs or videos, without written records for common people, children and grandchildren are how you achieve immortality. If you're lucky, stories about you might be passed down a generation or two, and then you'll be forgotten completely. Just another person who once lived and worked and died in this village. The world beyond the village continues to change in ways you hear about but don't directly experience. The 100 Years' War between England and France continues, with occasional victories and defeats that seem to have little impact on your daily life. Kings and nobles die and are replaced by their heirs. The Pope, who moved to Avignon in France decades ago, is involved in complex political struggles. There are rumors of heretical movements, people questioning church doctrine, being burned at the stake for their beliefs. Technology is slowly improving. You hear about new designs for plows and harrows, about improvements in metallurgy that produce better quality iron, about developments in ship design that allow ships to sail farther and carry more cargo, about mechanical clocks being installed in some cathedrals, though you've never seen one. These changes are happening slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they're happening, laying the groundwork for the massive transformations that will come in future centuries. The economy continues its slow transformation from feudalism towards capitalism. More transactions use money. Markets become more important. Some peasants are getting rich, by village standards, by producing surplus crops to sell. Others are getting poorer, unable to compete or struck by bad luck. The social leveling that the plague temporarily created is disappearing, replaced by new inequalities based on economic success rather than just birth.
You find yourself somewhere in the middle of this new economic order. You're not rich, but you're comfortable. You have more land than you can work yourself, so you hire labor during busy seasons. You produce enough surplus to sell, giving you money to buy things you can't make. You've managed to save a small amount, hidden in a cloth bag buried under your hearth, insurance against bad years. You're not going to starve, and barring catastrophe, neither are your children or grandchildren. As you approach old age, you start thinking about death more seriously. You've seen many people die over the years, some quickly from disease or accident, others slowly from age and infirmity. You've developed a philosophical attitude toward death, accepting it as inevitable, something to be prepared for rather than feared. You've made arrangements for your burial, setting aside money to pay for prayers for your soul, designating which of your possessions will go to which family members. The Church teaches that after death comes judgment, heaven for the righteous, hell for the wicked, and purgatory for most people, a place of temporary suffering where sins are purged away before you can enter heaven. You find this doctrine both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it means your hard life has meaning, that suffering in this world will be rewarded in the next. Terrifying because you're not sure you've been righteous enough, haven't sinned too much, haven't failed in ways that will condemn you. Father Peter tries to reassure you. Your sins are common ones, he says, the sins of ordinary people trying to survive. Occasional anger, lustful thoughts, envy of those who have more, pride in your accomplishments. These are venial sins, easily forgiven through confession and penance. You haven't murdered or committed adultery or blasphemed against God. You've raised your children in the faith, attended Mass regularly, paid your tithes to the church. You'll spend some time in purgatory, certainly, but not an eternity. And your family can shorten that time by paying for Masses to be said for your soul. This transactional view of salvation, where sins can be balanced by good deeds
and suffering can be reduced by payments strikes you as strange when you think about it. But it's the theology you've been taught, and it offers a framework for understanding life and death that provides some comfort. You do your best to be good, confess when you fail, and hope that's enough. The final years of your life are quiet ones. You're too old for heavy farm work now, so Richard and his sons do most of it, giving you a share of the harvest in exchange. You spend your days doing light work, mending tools, watching grandchildren, sitting in the sun and talking with other old men about the past. You've become a repository of village history, remembering events from decades ago, able to settle disputes about who owned which strip of land or when the old mill burned down. Young people sometimes come to you for advice, and you try to help, though you're aware that the world is changing in ways you don't fully understand. The certainties you grew up with, the fixed social hierarchy, the unquestioned authority of church and Lord, these seem less certain to the younger generation. They ask questions that would have been unthinkable in your youth. They chafe against restrictions that you accepted without thought. You try to counsel caution, warning them that challenging authority is dangerous, but you also understand their frustration in ways you don't fully articulate even to yourself. One winter evening, sitting by the fire with Joan beside you, you feel a strange sensation, a tightness in your chest that grows and spreads. You know what this is. You've seen it enough times. Your heart is failing, and you're going to die, probably tonight or tomorrow. You tell Joan, and she nods, accepting this as you accept it. She calls for your daughters and their families, sends word to the church for Father Peter to come and administer last rites. They gather around your bed, these people who've become your family in this medieval world. Your wife, Joan, holding your hand, your daughters and their husbands, your grandchildren, wide-eyed and solemn, Richard and Alice, who've been like family to you, a few neighbors and friends. Father Peter arrives and performs the ritual, anointing you with oil, hearing your final confession, offering you the comfort of the Church's promises about eternal life. As consciousness fades, you have a moment of strange double vision. You see these medieval people surrounding you, grief on their faces, and simultaneously, you remember another life, another world, people you once knew, whose faces you can barely recall. You wonder if that life was real or just a dream, if you'll wake up back in the 21st century and remember this medieval life as a vivid fantasy. But no, that's not what happens. This is your real life, this medieval existence, and it's ending now, here, surrounded by people who love you in their way.
Your last thought is surprisingly peaceful. You've lived a full life, a hard life, certainly, but not a meaningless one. You've worked the land, raised children, been part of a community. You've loved and been loved. You've experienced joy and sorrow and the whole range of human emotion. You've survived plague and hardship and loss, and now you're dying in your own bed, surrounded by family, with a priest to comfort you, which is more than many people get in this world. It's enough. It has to be enough. And with that thought, you slip away, your consciousness fading like a candle flame blown out by a gentle breath. The medieval world continues without you, as it continued before you arrived. The endless cycle of birth and death, planting and harvest, summer and winter. Your body will be buried in the churchyard, your name carved on a wooden cross that will rot away in a few years. Your grandchildren will remember you for a while, but within a generation or two, you'll be forgotten. Just another ancestor in a long line stretching back into the mists of time and forward into an unknowable future. But let's not end there, not quite yet. Let's step back from this individual life and look at the bigger picture, at what medieval life really meant in the grand sweep of history. Because understanding this period helps us understand ourselves and our own time. The medieval period, roughly from 500 CE to 1500 CE, was a time of incredible diversity and change. The early Middle Ages, often called the Dark Ages, saw the collapse of Roman authority in Western Europe and the emergence of new kingdoms and cultures. This was a time of upheaval and uncertainty, when literacy declined, trade networks broke down, and people struggled to create order from chaos. But it was also a time of creativity, when new forms of government emerged, when Christianity spread and evolved, when the foundations were laid for what would become modern European civilization. The High Middle Ages, roughly 1000 to 1300, saw a flowering of culture and prosperity. Population grew dramatically as new agricultural techniques allowed more people to be fed. Towns and cities expanded, trade revived, great cathedrals were built, monuments to faith and engineering that still stand today. Universities were founded, the power of the church reached its peak, art and literature flourished. This was the medieval period at its most confident and successful. The late Middle Ages, from about 1300 to 1500, saw crisis and transformation. The climate cooled slightly, reducing agricultural yields and causing famines. The Black Death killed a third to half of Europe's population. Wars became more destructive and prolonged. The church's authority was challenged by heretics and reformers. Social structures that had seemed eternal began to crack and shift. But this period of crisis also saw incredible innovation. The printing press was invented. Gunpowder changed warfare. Exploration began connecting Europe to the wider world. The Renaissance was beginning, though people living through it didn't know they were part of such a transformative time. Throughout all these changes, certain fundamental aspects of medieval life remained constant. It was a world built on agriculture, where most people worked the land and everything else depended on that agricultural surplus. It was a deeply religious world, where faith wasn't just something you did on Sundays, but a fundamental part of how you understood reality. It was a hierarchical world, where social position was determined largely by birth, and where the idea of social mobility was foreign and even threatening. And it was a local world, where most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born, where the village or town was the entire universe that mattered.
Medieval people weren't stupid or ignorant in the way we sometimes assume. They were intelligent people working with the knowledge and tools available to them. They made observations about the natural world and drew conclusions, even if those conclusions were sometimes wrong. They developed sophisticated theories about medicine and astronomy and natural philosophy, even if those theories weren't based on the scientific method as we understand it. They created art and literature and music of incredible beauty and complexity. They built structures, both physical and social, that endured for centuries. What they lacked wasn't intelligence, but scientific infrastructure. They didn't have microscopes to see bacteria, so they couldn't understand disease transmission. They didn't have telescopes to observe distant planets, so their astronomy was limited. They didn't have precision instruments to measure temperature or pressure or chemical reactions, so their experiments were crude. They didn't have printing presses, so knowledge spread slowly and often got corrupted in transmission. They didn't have universities focused on empirical research, so learning was more about mastering existing knowledge than creating new knowledge. But within these limitations, medieval people accomplished remarkable things. They cleared forests and drained swamps, expanding the amount of land under cultivation. They developed crop rotation systems that maintained soil fertility. They bred better varieties of plants and animals. They invented the heavy plow, the horse collar, the stirrup, the watermill, the windmill, the mechanical clock. They created legal systems based on precedent and written law. They developed banking and credit systems that facilitated long-distance trade. They built cathedrals that remain among the most beautiful buildings ever constructed.
Medieval society was also more complex and varied than popular culture often portrays. It wasn't all knights and castles and fair maidens. Most people were farmers, yes, but there were also merchants and craftsmen, sailors and soldiers, monks and nuns, scholars and artists. There were rich peasants and poor nobles. There were free towns that governed themselves, and serfs who were tied to the land. There were sophisticated courts where literature and music flourished, and isolated villages where life hadn't changed in centuries. Women's roles were more varied than we often assume. While most women were indeed restricted to the domestic sphere, some women achieved power and influence. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled territories and led armies. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen were respected scholars and theologians. Businesswomen like the silk weavers of Paris ran successful enterprises. Even ordinary women exercised power within their households and communities in ways that history has often overlooked. The relationship between medieval people and their environment was also more complex than we might think. While they certainly transformed landscapes through farming and building, they also lived more in tune with natural cycles than modern people do. They understood weather patterns and seasonal changes intimately because their lives depended on it. They knew which plants were edible or medicinal, which animals were dangerous, which times of year were best for various activities. This practical ecological knowledge was passed down through generations and represented a sophisticated understanding of local environments. Medieval people also had rich cultural lives despite their material poverty. They told stories, sang songs, played games, danced, celebrated festivals. They had folk traditions and local customs that gave meaning to their lives. They created beauty even in the midst of hardship, decorating their churches with carvings and paintings, embroidering their best clothes, making their simplest possessions as beautiful as their skills allowed. They found joy in music and stories and the company of others, pleasures that don't require wealth or technology. The violence of medieval life, while real, is often exaggerated in popular culture. Most people didn't spend their time fighting battles or defending castles. They lived relatively peaceful lives, punctuated by occasional violence, but not defined by it. Warfare, when it occurred, affected relatively small numbers of people directly, though it could disrupt trade and agriculture with wider effects. The medieval legal system, while crude by modern standards, wasn't simply arbitrary violence. There were courts and judges and established procedures. People had rights, even if those rights varied depending on their social status. Trial by combat and ordeal, the dramatic methods we often hear about, were actually relatively rare and hedged about with restrictions. Most legal disputes were settled through testimony, oath-taking, and negotiation, just like in any society. Medieval medicine, while based on incorrect theories, wasn't completely useless. Some herbal remedies did work, even if people didn't understand why. Setting broken bones, stitching wounds, basic surgery, these were all performed with varying degrees of success. Medieval physicians and healers accumulated practical knowledge through observation and experience, and some of their treatments were genuinely helpful. The problem was distinguishing what worked from what didn't, without the benefit of controlled experiments and statistical analysis.
Education in medieval times was limited, but not absent. Monasteries and cathedral schools taught reading and writing, primarily in Latin. Universities emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, teaching theology, law, and medicine. While education was restricted to a small elite, it did exist, and literacy rates, while low, were higher than in many earlier periods. Books were rare and expensive, handwritten on parchment, but they circulated among scholars and educated clergy, preserving and transmitting knowledge. The medieval economy was more dynamic than the stereotype of static feudalism suggests. Trade networks connected Europe to Asia and Africa. Markets flourished in towns and cities.
Banking developed, with Italian merchants pioneering techniques like double-entry bookkeeping and letters of credit. Guilds regulated crafts and training, ensuring quality and protecting members' interests. While economic growth was slower than in modern times, it did occur, with periods of prosperity and expansion alternating with periods of contraction and crisis. Medieval people's relationship with time was fundamentally different from ours. Without mechanical clocks, time was measured by natural rhythms, sunrise and sunset, seasonal changes, the church bells calling people to prayer. This made time more flexible, but also less precise. A day's work was a day's work, from sunrise to sunset, not 8 hours measured by a clock. This had both advantages and disadvantages. People couldn't coordinate activities with the precision we take for granted, but they also weren't tyrannized by schedules and deadlines in the way we are. The medieval sense of space was also different. Without maps or accurate geography, people understood space in terms of journeys and relationships rather than abstract measurements. A place was near or far, depending on how long it took to walk there, not how many miles away it was. The world was organized into familiar space, the village and immediate surroundings you knew intimately, and foreign space, everywhere else, about which you might have vague and often inaccurate ideas. Medieval people's understanding of the past was colored by their worldview in interesting ways. They didn't have our sense of historical development, of societies changing and progressing over time. Instead, they often imagined the past as being much like the present, just with different people. This is why medieval art depicting biblical scenes shows people wearing medieval clothing and living in medieval buildings. It wasn't ignorance exactly, just a different way of conceptualizing time and history. The role of Christianity in medieval life cannot be overstated. It wasn't just a religion, but a total worldview that explained everything, from the creation of the universe to why you shouldn't eat meat on Friday. The church was the only institution that spanned all of Europe, connecting isolated communities to a larger whole. It provided social services, operating hospitals and schools and orphanages. It preserved knowledge by maintaining libraries and scriptoria where books were copied. It offered the only career path for talented individuals from poor backgrounds, as clergy could rise based on ability rather than birth. But the church was also a political and economic power that sometimes prioritized its own interests over spiritual concerns. Bishops and abbots were often more concerned with managing their estates and advancing their careers than with ministering to the faithful. The Inquisition, established to root out heresy, used torture and execution to enforce conformity. The medieval church, like any large institution, was complex and contradictory, capable of inspiring great devotion and great cynicism simultaneously. If you've stayed with this story all the way to this point, if your mind is now quiet and your body relaxed, ready for sleep, then this narrative has accomplished its purpose. Before you drift off completely, please remember to subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more of these historical journeys designed specifically to help you find peaceful rest. And when you wake, refreshed and restored, take a moment to leave a comment about what historical period you'd like to explore next. Your engagement helps us continue creating these deeply researched, carefully crafted stories.
The legacy of the medieval period is all around us, even if we don't always recognize it. Our legal systems trace back to medieval precedents. Our universities evolved from medieval institutions. Many of our cities were founded in medieval times. The English language itself was shaped during this period, as Old English mixed with Norman French to create Middle English, which eventually evolved into the modern English we speak today. Even our sense of romance, of chivalry, and courtly love has medieval roots. though the reality was far more complex than the legend. The medieval period also shaped our understanding of religion and faith. The great theological debates of medieval scholars about the nature of God and the relationship between faith and reason influenced how Western Christianity developed. The art and architecture of medieval churches, from small village chapels to great cathedrals, created a visual language of religious devotion that still moves people today. The music of medieval liturgy, Gregorian chant, and polyphonic masses established traditions that continue in various forms. Medieval cuisine, while often mocked, was more sophisticated than we might assume. Wealthy people ate spiced meats, elaborate pies, fresh fruits and vegetables in season. Cookbooks from the period show complex recipes requiring skill and knowledge. While peasants ate simply, they also ate seasonally and locally in ways that modern food movements are trying to recapture. The medieval feast, with its multiple courses and elaborate presentations, was ancestor to modern haute cuisine. Medieval fashion, for those who could afford it, was colorful and elaborate. Wealthy people wore silk and velvet and bright dyes, adorned with embroidery and jewels. Even ordinary people's best clothes were often dyed in cheerful colors and decorated according to their means. The idea that medieval clothing was all brown and gray is a myth perpetuated by Hollywood. Reality was more colorful, though also more variable depending on wealth and status. Medieval entertainment was more diverse than we often imagine. People played games like chess and backgammon and dice. They watched mystery plays that dramatized biblical stories. They attended tournaments where knights competed in martial sports. They listened to traveling performers, musicians, and storytellers and acrobats. They participated in seasonal festivals with dancing and singing and feasting. They hunted and hawked, practiced archery, played ball games. Life wasn't all work and prayer, though those certainly dominated. The transition from medieval to early modern times was gradual and uneven, happening at different rates in different places. The Black Death was one catalyst for change, disrupting social structures and creating labor shortages that gave common people more bargaining power. The invention of the printing press around 1450 was another, making books cheaper and more available, spreading knowledge and ideas more widely. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century challenged the Church's monopoly on religious authority. The discovery of the Americas opened new trade routes and brought enormous wealth to Europe. The scientific revolution began applying systematic observation and experimentation to understanding the natural world. But even as these changes occurred, many aspects of life remained medieval well into the 17th or even 18th centuries. Most people continued to work the land using traditional methods. Social hierarchies persisted, though with different justifications. Religion remained central to most people's lives. Communities remained local and relatively isolated. The transformation from medieval to modern was a process that took centuries, not a sudden shift. Looking back at medieval times from our modern vantage point, it's easy to focus on the hardships and the differences, to congratulate ourselves on the progress we've made. And certainly, modern life is better in many ways. We live longer, healthier lives. We have access to far more knowledge and opportunities. We have technologies that would seem like magic to medieval people. We have social systems that at least aspire to treat people fairly regardless of birth. These are genuine achievements worthy of appreciation. But medieval life also had qualities worth recognizing. There was a sense of community that modern individualism often lacks. There was a connection to nature and natural rhythms that our urban, technological lives have lost. There was a sense of purpose and meaning provided by religious faith, however we might question the specific beliefs. There was the satisfaction of creating tangible things with your own hands, of seeing the direct results of your labor. There was the security, however limited, of knowing your place in a stable social order. Medieval people were not so different from us, despite the vast gulf of time and culture that separates us.
They loved their children, cared for their friends, worked hard to build decent lives within their circumstances. They laughed and cried, hoped and feared, struggled with moral questions and practical problems. They were fully human with all the complexity that implies, trying to make sense of their world just as we try to make sense of ours. Understanding medieval life helps us understand that human nature is remarkably constant across time and cultures. The specific forms change, technologies advance, social structures evolve, but the fundamental human experiences of birth and death, love and loss, work and rest, joy and sorrow, these remain the same. A medieval peasant working in the fields had different concerns than a modern office worker, but both experienced the satisfaction of a job well done, the frustration of obstacles, the desire for rest at day's end.
The medieval period also reminds us that progress isn't inevitable or linear. Civilizations can advance and then collapse. Knowledge can be gained and then lost. Social systems can become more just and then regress. The fall of Rome led to centuries of disruption and decline in some ways, though also innovation and new beginnings in others. The Black Death was catastrophic, but it also catalyzed social changes that benefited common people. History doesn't move in a straight line from primitive to advanced, from bad to good. It's messy and complicated, with advances and retreats, progress and regression, all mixed together. As you lie in your comfortable bed, in your climate-controlled room, with all the wonders of modern technology at your fingertips, perhaps take a moment to appreciate both how far we've come and what we might have lost along the way. We've gained so much in material comfort and opportunity, in health and lifespan and knowledge, but we've also lost some things: the tight-knit communities, the connection to land and seasons, the sense of transcendent meaning that religion provided, the satisfaction of traditional crafts and skills. The story of the person who woke up in medieval times is, in a way, a story about all of us. We're all trying to navigate worlds we didn't choose, to make sense of circumstances we didn't create, to build meaningful lives within whatever constraints we face. The medieval peasant and the modern worker are separated by centuries and enormous cultural differences, but both are engaged in the same fundamental human project of survival and meaning-making. Medieval times were neither the romantic utopia of legend nor the brutal nightmare of stereotype. They were simply a time when people lived and loved and worked and died, facing challenges different from ours, but not fundamentally alien to human experience. By understanding medieval life in its complexity and humanity, we gain perspective on our own lives and our own times. We see both progress and loss, both what we've gained and what we've given up in the long journey from then to now. And so our journey through medieval time comes to an end. The person who woke up in 1347 lived a full life in that strange world, adapted to its rhythms and demands, found meaning and purpose within its constraints, and finally died peacefully, having made a place in a time not their own. It's a metaphor, perhaps, for all human life, our attempts to make homes in a world we don't fully understand, to connect with others across gulfs of difference, to find purpose in circumstances beyond our control. As your eyes grow heavy and sleep approaches, carry with you not the specific details of this medieval life, but the deeper truths it illustrates, that humans are remarkably adaptable, capable of finding meaning and even happiness in vastly different circumstances, that every time and place has its own logic and beauty, however alien it might seem from outside, that the fundamental human experiences transcend specific cultural forms,
that life is always both harder and richer than we imagine from a distance. Sleep well, knowing that countless generations before you have faced their own challenges and found their own solutions, that the human story continues through all changes and upheavals, that morning will come with new challenges and new opportunities, just as it always has. Rest in the knowledge that you're part of something larger than yourself, a long chain of human experience stretching back into the distant past and forward into an unknowable future. Let the story of medieval life fade into your dreams, its rhythms slowing your thoughts, its details blurring into peaceful unconsciousness. Thank you for joining this journey through time, for exploring with open mind and imagination what life was truly like in a world so different from our own. If you found peace in this story, if it helped you disconnect from modern worries and drift into restful sleep, then it has served its purpose. Subscribe to Dreamless Timelines for more historical journeys designed to soothe your mind and invite peaceful rest. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or suggesting where you'd like to travel next through the landscapes of history. And until we meet again in another time and place, sleep well and dream peacefully. The medieval world fades now, its sounds growing distant, its images becoming dim. The smell of wood smoke and earth, the feel of rough wool and cold stone, the taste of dark bread and weak ale, all receding into memory or dream. You're returning to your own time, your own world, carrying with you perhaps a deeper appreciation for the lives people lived, the challenges they faced, the victories they won in times very different from ours. Let these images and stories accompany you into sleep, their gentle rhythms matching your slowing breath, their ancient patience soothing your modern anxieties. Good night, traveler through time. Rest well in your own era, in your own bed, grateful for all you have, but also aware of all that humans have endured and accomplished throughout history. The medieval world continues in memory and in ruins, in documents and in DNA, in languages and in laws, reminding us of where we came from and how far we've traveled. But for now, let it all fade into peaceful darkness, into the restorative silence of sleep, where past and present dissolve into timeless rest. Sleep now, sleep deep, sleep well. The story is complete, the journey finished, the medieval world returning to the history books where it belongs. Your own life awaits in the morning with its modern challenges and comforts, but tonight you've walked in the shoes of those who came before, understood a little better what it meant to be human in a very different time. And perhaps that understanding will enrich your waking hours, even as the story itself fades from conscious memory into the deeper realms where all stories ultimately reside.